Welcome to Health Matters by MarketScan. I am your host, Dr. Medina Hinojosa, and this is my co-host,
Alisa Johnson.
And today, in this episode of Health Matters, we're extremely excited about this guest that we have for your audience today. We're going to talk a little bit about who he is and what he does in a few minutes. But before we do that, Alisa, remind us, what is Health Matters?
I would be happy to. So the mission of Health Matters is to promote health equity and to discuss healthy habits and preventative health topics and any other relevant public health issue. By approaching these topics with an equitable lens, we really hope to empower individuals, aka you listeners, to make informed decisions about your health.
Awesome. But in the last few episodes, or many, we have focused on COVID-19. So is this a COVID-19 podcast, Alisa?
Right now it is. Like I say always, it's the most relevant health issue that is happening right now. So yes. Yeah. And later we'll go on to explore more topics, but at the time, yes.
Every decision in our life and everything that we do right now is based and surrounded by something related to COVID. So for the next future, we will be focusing on COVID-19 related topics and evolve as the pandemic gets better. So Alisa, can you please go ahead and introduce our guest?
Absolutely. So we are happy to bring Dr. Jonathan BAKTARI to you guys today. He's the CEO and Chief Medical Officer of E7 Health, a preventative health and wellness company supervised by board-certified doctors with locations in Las Vegas and Chicago. So welcome. Thank you for being here, Dr. BAKTARI. And if you could just hop in and share a little bit about your background and also about E7 Health.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. So I'm originally an internist pulmonary critical care doctor. But for the past decade or so, I've been at the helm of E7 Health, which was originally actually called the Vaccine Center. So we are a clinic and a company that specializes mainly in adult vaccinations. We've been doing it essentially continuously since 1994. We get involved in all types of preventative healthcare as it involves vaccinations for adults, whether it's for travel, student health, employee health, for different types of physicals. So this is our sort of bread and butter. And as I always joke, we were sort of like a COVID company before COVID happened. This is what we were doing.
Awesome. I mean, yeah, that is, COVID is, dare I say, a perfect fit for your company right now. And not a perfect fit for anybody, but you guys were well equipped to handle it, certainly. And how about yourself? Where are you from originally? What's your background?
Yeah, I grew up in the Midwest in Chicago, and then for my education, I kind of traveled. I was at Case Western Reserve for college, and Ohio State for medical school, Northwestern for residency, UCLA for fellowship. So I was one of these that just followed the path for my education and went to the best places I could find for what I wanted to do. And so traveled west and eventually wound up in Southern Nevada.
Wow.
Right. I'm pretty sure the weather had something to do with it. Maybe Alisa and I from Minnesota can relate to that.
Yeah, well, Chicago weather compared to Las Vegas area weather. I think that I can see the competitiveness.
Yeah. Although there's a certain charm to the Midwest that I think most of us miss.
Chicago hot dogs, so good.
Many things. So, Dr. BAKTARI, I'm extremely delighted for the opportunity to have you in the show today. You and I share a lot of common interest around medicine, especially in the preventative aspect, right? And I think it's been a long year, or more than a year now. We're in the middle of April. We've been resilient, and we've joined as communities. We have to thank our healthcare heroes and everybody working in the sidelines and in the front lines to help mitigate the pandemic. There is a horizon there. There is an answer. There's many things, that have evolved. I like to start this interview with asking you a very broad question, which is, after a year of experience from someone with a pulmonary, background, an expert in the field in vaccines, is the vaccine the answer to the pandemic? Is this vaccine?
Yeah. I mean, long term, of course, I think that it is the answer. We're able to get a great handle on measles, mumps, rubella, and other vaccine-related illnesses. And long term, especially a virus like the SARS-CoV-2 virus, which is it's an upper respiratory virus. It's coronaviruses have been common. They're not going away. And I think vaccination is going to be part of the big solution to get to herd immunity and, sort of get back to normal. So I don't think it's going to be 2019 anytime soon, but I think it's got to be a big part of it because there's just no other way. The cost of not doing it would be pretty tragic if it just ran its course.
So considering the importance of vaccination and ending the pandemic or bringing it towards a close, could you talk about the different vaccines and how they compare? What is available in the U.S. and what's the difference between them?
Yeah, great question. Well, the first two that were approved by the FDA for emergency use authorization, was the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccine, which uses mRNA technology, which we can talk about a little bit. The Johnson & Johnson, which was more recently approved, uses a viral vector, a common cold virus. But at the end of the day, both technologies involve taking genetic code and using some sort of vehicle to get that genetic code into your shoulders. And then your body takes that genetic code, and that genetic code in this case is for the spike protein of the SARS-CoV-2 virus. And your body then produces it. You yourself actually produce the spike proteins. And then your body says, oh, these spike proteins are foreign, and you create antibodies towards it. And so when you are finally exposed to the virus, you're protected. It's interesting. The mRNA vaccine has been around for a while, 10 years or so at least. And it was sitting in the laboratory. And my own personal view is nobody had the guts to pull it out and create a vaccine from it because there would have been inherent resistance to having genetic material poked into your shoulder. I think there would have been a lot of social barriers to overcome. But of course, in many ways, the pandemic, put a gun to our head and we said, oh, let's try that. So the whole idea with the mRNA vaccine is we take a little piece of the genetic code of the spike protein from the SARS-CoV-2 virus, just add a little bit, and we put it in a soap bubble or a lipid particle. And then we inject it into you, and that soap bubble gets absorbed into your cells. And that strand of mRNA, which is sort of like a mirror image of DNA genetic code, is then your body uses it to actually make the spike protein. So that is actually a revolutionary new way of creating a vaccine, never done before. And then, of course, the vector method, which was tried with Ebola and other, which was even tried with HIV, by the way, the vector method where we took a cold virus and put the DNA of the spike protein in the cold virus and injected that to your arm. That was a little more traditional, although that's had the vector method also has somewhat of a checkered past of not being successful in the past, but that was at least known technology. So it's a little ironic that the mRNA technology, which everyone was so afraid of like in December, is now considered like maybe the safer thing. But so that's how we got to today.
So I think this makes me prompt a very important question based on the expertise you just outlined. Because 4 months, or more than a year, we have, let's say months, we have gotten we have to battle the argument of this vaccine was rushed. And I think that's extremely frequent that we get that question. extremely frequent, that we have to promote the fact that it wasn't rushed. And you have just outlined several reasons why it was not rushed, and it's now the new technology is actually proven to be a little bit more effective and good. So just straight out question, was this vaccine rushed? Was any of the three that are available rushed at all, or what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, honestly, to answer that question, I'd like to answer another question, if you don't mind. And that other question is, why are vaccines inherently, cause resistance in certain groups? I mean, let's put aside the COVID vaccine. Mm-hmm. Certain parents don't want their kids to get vaccines, and whether we talked about the anti-vaxxers and or that whole genre of people. There's Facebook groups of people who don't want their children to get vaccines and what have you. So the bigger question for a guy who's been doing vaccines for over a decade is why? What is it about vaccines that people inherently may have an issue with? Because, last I checked, there is no Facebook group of moms saying, don't ever give my kids antibiotics as a class of drugs. Or there is no Facebook group or group that is, there's no anti-chemotherapy groups or anti-antibiotic groups. So, because a lot of those actually have even more side effects than vaccines. So what is it about vaccines that lends itself to a certain percentage of the population in being inherently resistant to it? And I think that really comes down to the fact that vaccines as a class are the only class of, if you want to call them drugs, although I don't think in many ways they're not really drugs, but they're the only class that the government forces you to get in certain situations. Like, you want to send your kid to second grade or seventh grade, you got to get this. And anytime the government steps in and says, you got to do something, nobody is forcing moms to give antibiotics to their kids, mm-hmm. right? And so, I find that very interesting because as a class, so when COVID vaccine came along, you almost knew that there would be a group that, and that some of the concerns are legitimate, but aside from that, the non-legitimate concerns, that there's nothing you can say that would pacify certain groups when it comes to COVID vaccine or any vaccine sometimes. So I think inherently, vaccines have that challenge coming out of the gate. Even from a public health point of view, you're going to have groups of people. But I think the other thing to really keep in mind is, unlike antibiotics and unlike chemotherapy, vaccines really should be the opposite. It's probably one of the most natural things you can do, because when we give a vaccine, metaphorically, what we're doing is we're taking the bug, putting it in a blender and injecting the toes and, feed into you, and your body thinks it's seeing the whole virus, and you naturally create antibodies towards it. So if I was living in a vacuum, I would think vaccines would be the most well-received things out of all the classes, because it's not really a chemical. We're just trying to introduce, the elbow and the toe of the virus to you and fool your body. So I can't think of anything that's more natural.
No, absolutely. Yeah. And one that I actually hear a lot from a public health standpoint, when I'm talking to individuals who have, for example, had COVID before, they say, well, why should I get vaccinated? I already had COVID. Or they say, oh, well, I'll just get sick with COVID and then I'll have immunity to it. So what would the answer be to that? I already know the answer, but, to share with individuals that might have that excuse.
Yeah, I mean, for people who've already had COVID, I mean, theoretically, you could make a case in not getting the vaccine. But the problem is, we don't know if the immunity from having the virus is going to be longer than from having the vaccine. And I think that's really the general health strategy, because you're just betting that the immunity from having COVID is going to last this long versus, from actually getting the vaccine. So I think that's where that's coming from, where it's better just to get both, and then you don't have to figure out which one's going to last longer.
Or to just get the vaccine and not to get COVID.
Right. Yeah.
Yep. Not get it in the first place.
Well, that goes to my other little story where people say, well, I really don't want to. I really don't want to get the vaccine. And the way I look at it is, statistically, let's just do the math. we have 35 million documented cases of COVID in the United States, right? That's 35 million. That's documented. Those are people who had a positive test. Many experts think there's a multiple of that who got COVID and we don't have a positive test for. And no matter what number you believe, whether you think the multiple is 2 or 4 or 6, that roughly puts about 100 to 150 million Americans that have already gotten COVID, which is, anywhere from 30% of the population already have already met the virus. So it's not like you're not going to meet the virus if you don't get the vaccine. Statistically, I would imagine you've got a pretty high chance of meeting this virus one way or another. So the question is, do you want to meet the spike protein with the virus right behind it? Or you want to meet the spike protein, without the virus? And that's where the vaccine argument should come in. You should want to get the spike protein without the whole virus behind it. I mean, because there is no option C. If you assume statistically, if you don't get the vaccine, you got a 50-50 chance or better of getting the full virus. So which one would you rather have? And I think that's what I tell patients. Which one would you rather have?
And with the vaccine, of course, you get the added protection, right? Because numbers for all vaccines show that you protect from getting COVID with a high efficacy. But the most important number, at least I might sound as a broken record to our audience by now, but I say the most important number across the 3 vaccines is the nearly 100% protection of you getting a severe disease, hospitalized or death. And if you compare any of the frequencies of the side effects that we can talk about it in a minute, you're going to see that you rather have some of it compared to the likelihood of you meet the virus, as you're saying, in the other capacity, and the likelihood of you dying or having a severe disease with long-term effects that we're not sure what they're going to be because it's 1 year only. And we have to wait and see.
Yeah. And I mean, it's like, imagine you're prepping your house for a hurricane and you can stormproof it yourself, which you're not trained to do. And you might, have a disaster once the hurricane gets there, or you could hire somebody that's skilled in stormproofing to stormproof your house to make sure that you're okay once the hurricane comes. I mean, this vaccine is created with that sole purpose.
No, I couldn't agree with you more. If you really look at the big picture, the decision is pretty obvious. I think you're hurting yourself if you're not, but go ahead. Sorry.
Dr. BAKTARI, so you basically described a very good rationale against vaccine hesitancy, right? But going to that subject of hesitancy, and knowing your experience with vaccines in the past, has this been frequent with other diseases or the vaccines that protect against other diseases? Can you identify any common denominator beyond the ones you told us?
In terms of what?
Are people hesitant in your field to get the yellow fever vaccine or get the flu shot or get any other vaccine?
No, we see it all the time. We see, people saying, well, I'll just be careful, or like if people are traveling to, like you mentioned, yellow fever, to endemic areas of the world where yellow fever is a problem, they're like, I'll just, drink bottled water and be careful and what have you. Mosquitoes don't really know, that you're careful or not. I mean, if you get bitten, you get bitten. And so, I think that hesitancy is there. And I think there is a connotation that which I really would like to dispel, that vaccines are medications or, in essence, are foreign stuff. The vaccine manufacturers in the last 20, 30 years have removed a lot of the, antigens that used to go into making a vaccine. They're much more pure. They've gotten rid of many, many of the older stuff that, when I was a kid, the measles shot I got, what have you. And so, it's very rare to have any significant side effects. It's still possible, but when you compare it to the risk of anesthesia, to the risk of, having a procedure done, having an appendectomy, I think it's very, very safe. But I think there is this connotation that someone's injecting medication into me, and I don't want medication. And it's not really medication. I tell patients over and over, it's for the most part, in essence, metaphorically, you're getting body parts of the virus you don't want to get.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that this has any, this hesitancy for vaccination, if it has anything to do with the pain associated with the injection itself? I mean, I think that sounds like a very childish response, but I asked myself, taking a pill, there's not really much of a pain associated with it.
Yeah, that's a good point. Especially you see that obviously in pediatrics and certain adults. Yeah, I mean, nobody wants to do, it's almost like the difference between brushing your teeth and flossing. I think one of the reasons people don't floss is just the pain associated with it. So, I could certainly see that, that nobody wants to kind of roll up their sleeve and know they're going to get a needle. So, yeah, that probably makes sense. But I think this mandating anything will always get a certain group of people to be against it. I mean, you can mandate, going into a library and probably get a group of people that would be opposed to it.
Yeah, that's an extremely good thought, and thank you for sharing that. Alisa has been able to share across our interactions her experience. She unfortunately got COVID early in the pandemic and had a lot of symptoms. Very, not hospitalized, but was able to stay at home. But I'll let her tell me a little bit about that. And she also was vaccinated against and got symptoms from that too. So tell Alisa, take the opportunity to share that again, just for people to know what would you rather.
Yeah, and I think it's important to share too, because I speak really highly of the vaccine, but I can say on my days after my 2 doses, I was cursing the name of the vaccine for a moment or two, because it's uncomfortable. I suppose I always say it's uncomfortable, but it wasn't as bad as having COVID. When I got sick, I don't know what the cause of, I didn't have any contact with somebody who had a confirmed case or anything, but I got sick in October and I was just knocked off my feet. I was on the couch for about 2 weeks. No taste, no smell, upset stomach, just sweating constantly. It was extremely uncomfortable. And then a bit of fatigue for too for the month about following. So, really just for a healthy young individual, it was pretty devastating for a while. And I've been fortunate to recover well, but when I did get my doses in February, yeah, I mean, I had low-grade fevers, pain, trouble sleeping, just really uncomfortable. But what I've got to say is that it's absolutely, I wouldn't want to risk getting sick with COVID again, because if for a young person, healthy, active, with no underlying conditions, if I was affected like that, it's a very unpredictable virus. I would have never expected to have had such a uncomfortable case of COVID. Well, not to mention, I forgot to mention the cough, which is, I think my brain blocked it out because it was very, very painful. But yeah, so I think that while we talk about vaccination, we have to keep it grounded and say, you know what, we do have these immune responses that can be uncomfortable, but it shows that your body's working and that it's having the effect that it needs to have. And with that, going from these normal responses that my body had to the vaccine, if we could talk a little bit about the Johnson & Johnson vaccine and some of the kind of abnormal, very rare effects that they've been seeing in a few cases. If you just wanted to talk a little bit about Johnson & Johnson as a vaccine and what's been happening.
Yeah, so Johnson & Johnson vaccine, like I said, was a vector vaccine where they use a cold virus, adenovirus, and they insert the spike protein DNA into the virus and then inject it into you. That was paused, as you know, recently because of 6 reported cases of clotting, mainly cerebral venous sinus thrombosis, which is a special type of blood clot in the veins that drain your brain. and one person died. They were all women between the ages of 18 and 48. One required surgery and one still critically ill. And so, yes, very unfortunate side effects. And so the FDA and the CDC made the decision to pause it. And part of the rationale for the pause is that this kind of clotting requires a different medication than we normally use for clotting. We normally use typically heparin for blood clots. And in this case, because this type of clot if it is caused by the vaccine, kind of replicates heparin-induced clots. They're rare forms of heparin-induced thrombocytopenia or HIT, and where antibodies are created towards the platelets, which are clotting factors. And we think, supposedly, maybe that in rare cases, the vaccine is producing these antibodies, which are activating platelets and also creating antibodies towards platelets. And so heparin would be contraindicated. And, another class of anticoagulants, thrombin inhibitor anticoagulants is indicated. So the FDA and the CDC said, part of the reason we're pausing is to let medical doctors know not to give heparin in someone who's had the vaccine and shows up with a blood clot, to use the appropriate, not your first line blood thinner, but use the second line, if you want to call it that. So that was the rationale for it. I think, what we have to consider is, what is the, public health cost of the pause versus, obviously, we don't want people to be treated incorrectly. And, were there other cases that weren't reported that they wanted to pause and look at? And so I think put together, that was their rationale for pausing.
So right now, as they're in this pause, are there studies that are taking place to see what maybe were some underlying conditions that these individuals had, or if there was a certain medication that they were taking?
Yeah, I think they've already looked at a lot of that. I think only one woman, as far as I recall, was on oral contraceptives, which would be obviously a big risk factor. But for whatever reason, it's hitting women, like I said, between the ages of 18 and 48. And it happens really about 6 to 13 days after they got the vaccine. And a lot of that mimics some of the AstraZeneca vaccine that happened in Europe. And why it affects women more, we don't know. We know women traditionally, if you believe this is an autoimmune phenomenon where you create antibodies to yourself against something that is you, like your own platelets. We know women have higher incidence of rheumatoid arthritis and lupus and what have you. So women, there's something about women's immune system that makes them, unusually have unusual risks for autoimmune and diseases that create antibodies against oneself. So the data is really out. I mean, we don't have it. I'm speculating, but I think that's where it's probably going to go. For whatever reason, women's immune system, when these rare things happen, it predominantly happens to women much more than men.
This is very, very interesting to know. Is there any other clinical pattern that we can rely on? Anything else at the moment beyond the ages of the women that they're mainly affecting women so far that we can identify, and the history of having the vaccine in the prior 3 weeks? Anything else that could help us identify a case?
Yeah, and I went through the information that was released. There's nothing else that is pretty obvious. I think the only other thing to really talk about is the sheer low numbers. I mean, we're talking about 6 cases out of 7 million shots in the United States. So statistically, it's just 1 in 2 million or what have you. Or 1 in a million. And if you then look at the risk of getting COVID and getting the same clots if you get it, your risk of getting roughly these kind of clots if you get COVID is, multiple of maybe 2 to 5 to 10 times the risk. So it's not like if you get COVID, you're not at risk for essentially some of the same clots. And also, other things like getting pregnant will give you significantly higher risk. Pregnancy is a hypercoagulable state. Just getting pregnant is an issue. And if you look at women who take oral birth control, they have a certain risk factor to get some of these clots. And they're certainly in the same range, if not higher than the risk. And, as I mentioned earlier, we don't stop people from getting pregnant or going on birth control. So it's a risk that, yes, of course, is unfortunate. And, we don't want anyone to get a blood clot. But you have to then weigh the benefit of the Johnson & Johnson. I certainly think if we had no other vaccine, making this pause would have been very, very tough.
Yeah.
I think what made this pause somewhat, tenable is that we did have these other options. And I think more than likely, I'll be really surprised when they, take off the pause that, they're still going to allow the Johnson & Johnson vaccine to be given to certainly anyone above 50 and maybe men under 50 and maybe just restricted not to give it to women in that age group. I'm speculating, but more than likely, I think that's what we're going to see from the FDA and the CDC.
Yeah, and that was going to be my next question. I mean, as a woman in that age group, I've already been vaccinated, but what can I tell other young women who maybe they're on oral contraceptives or even pregnant women? What can we tell them? Certainly, Johnson & Johnson isn't available, but yeah, what would be your message to them?
Well, I mean, so far there's no scientific data that says the mRNA vaccines have the same issue. So definitely that alternative is there. Like, I from everything I'm seeing, the supply is not that big of an issue right now for the Moderna and Pfizer vaccine. So I would say, if you're in that age group and you have those concerns, then that might be a better route to go. At least we have choices.
Absolutely.
I think over the last few months, we have been telling people that the vaccine was not rushed and was heavily tested, and I think we can agree on that. And the other thing that we have been saying is that there's surveillance going on, and the surveillance was there for a reason. And this is one of the reasons, right? Therethere's something abnormal, even though it's less than 1 in a million, or at least more than 1 in a million chances of the prevalence of this. That's the level of surveillance that we're having. So a little bit of it makes me feel some comfort when I talk to people. We're watching for possible things that we couldn't have caught during the clinical trials and the other observation periods, and this is good. The other reasoning for the pause is, as Dr. BAKTARI mentioning, is to allow for the reporting of additional cases that otherwise will not be associated. And the most important is to actually create awareness, telling clinicians all over the place, if there's a history of the Johnson & Johnson vaccination and some signs and symptoms of a blood clot, then we should consider this in our treatment strategy and treat accordingly. So there's a good rationale for that. We expect some changes, or we expect it to go back into the market, or into the offerings. The most important thing for listeners right now is to understand that regardless of the pause, if you're not vaccinated, you should be looking to get scheduling. Today we reached a milestone with many, many more places vaccines have been available to you or to people of all ages. So in reality, you should be looking for that appointment, looking for that place, figuring out what is the quickest way to get your vaccination. As we always say, the best vaccine is the one that's in your shoulder, and that's the one that we should be looking for.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think I think even when you see, the one fatality in the 6 cases of clot, what we've had more than 500,000 deaths from COVID-19. Let's say we didn't rush these vaccines, quote unquote, rush them, whatever you want to say, and waited another half a year. I mean, losing another 500,000 people, because these adverse small side effects, which are going to happen probably no matter what. It's just a looking at which way are you saving lives more, and we know anesthesia saves lives because we can do surgery to save people's lives. We know people will die from anesthesia. We don't withhold anesthesia because we know on balance we're going to save more lives than we might impact. So, this whole idea of rush or no rush, I mean, the reality is you have 500,000 people dying in almost half a year. You got to make a strong case to say, well, let's look at it for another 6 months. Well, how many more people are going to die while we take that, one little extra level of comfort?
Yeah, and one thing that I wanted to add is, as most of the things that we do in medicine when we talk to our patients is that shared decision. We do our best as clinicians to provide our patients with all the necessary information for them to make the decision. It is not expected to say, hey, Mr. Johnson, this is what you're going to get today, and this is what we're going to do. It's supposed to be a shared decision. We're supposed to be providing the options, and we do something very important, which is show the risk and weigh the benefits, which right now is what we're trying to do with this show, and trying to give you all the information that you need for your decision, for your informed decision. Again, you should be in the computer, in the phone, getting an appointment. That's extremely important right now.
Or asking someone to help you get an appointment, in case you're having troubles with it. Not everybody's a computer whiz, and that's okay.
And even trying to help your grandparents or your parents help an appointment, because we have talked repeatedly how important it is for you to help the less tech-savvy folks around you to get a shot. Or if you're not tech-savvy, find a tech-savvy cousin or kid or someone to help you out.
Yeah, and actually Mother's Day is around the corner. Getting mom a vaccine would be a beautiful Mother's Day gift.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess going back to, we've been talking about blood clots a lot. What are symptoms of blood clots?
Yeah, a lot of it has to do with where the blood clot is. So we talked about the cerebral venous clots or thrombosis, and those can present in traditional ways of like seizures, signs of a stroke, where you have weakness on one side, headache, change in vision. Those would be more the neurological symptoms. So if you have any of those, especially in the 1 to 2 week period after the vaccine, the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, that's something they consider. You can also get clots in your abdomen. So there have been some reported cases also with the AstraZeneca vaccine, clots in the abdomen, and also clots in the lung. The lung would be more shortness of breath. The abdomen one would be typical, abdominal pain, GI issues, and what have you. So it's important to know that theoretically you can get the clots anywhere, but the ones in this case were mainly the brain venous clots, and those would be more neurological, like I said.
And we've talked about how women on oral contraceptives or women that are pregnant, they're more likely to get blood clots, or they have a higher possibility of developing them. Are there any other groups that are more have more of a disposition to blood clots?
Just in general, people with cancers or people who are immobilized, who are bedridden, and certain malignancies and cancers can certainly put you in a hypercoagulable state. So those groups would also have to be worried.
And is there anything that people can do to prevent blood clots? Any tips or tricks?
Yeah, I would say normally yes, but these blood clots occur in the veins draining your brain. So obviously that's going to be a little trickier. But yeah, and honestly, in these cases, they're so rare that having millions of people do something to prevent one person, I'm not sure how effective it would be. But yeah, that's going to be tough for these kind of blood clots.
Yeah. And again, that's a case where the benefit outweighs the risk. Right now, there's no data for us to tell you that, and that's probably the way to go. Well, Dr. BAKTARI, this has been a delightful podcast. I cannot tell you how excited we are to have all your expertise with us today. I think our listeners will be extremely informed, and they will benefit a lot for the knowledge you have provided today.
That being said, Dr. BAKTARI, do you have any closing notes or comments that you would like to just end with?
Yeah, I mean, I think what I really stress to people is that, unlike a risk of, getting anesthesia where if it doesn't turn out well, you're talking about impacting yourself, whatever. So that's, you're willing to take the benefit. But I think most people with the COVID vaccine need to understand they're not only getting the benefit, but if they can protect a loved one or someone who might catch it from them. So it's really, you're also doing on some level of community service or service to the people you love. I think, when you make that internal decision of, going on birth control or not, those are risks you're taking. But when you decide not to get vaccinated, you're passing that risk theoretically onto others. So just keep that in mind when you're deciding whether to get it or not. If you don't think, hey, I'm willing to live with it, if I get it, I get it, that's one thing. It's another thing to say, okay, I get it, but then I might give it to someone I love or someone I care deeply about, and factor that into your decision making when you're trying to assess the risk benefit.
That is wonderful. Well, Dr. BAKTARI, again, thank you for being with us today. And Alisa, thank you again for co-hosting. This has been Health Matters by Market Scale. And thank you so much for listening.